Medical education in America was, by many accounts, a sprawling, decentralized, and often chaotic enterprise around the turn of the 20th century. Hundreds of small schools, some little more than diploma mills, offered a bewildering array of approaches, from conventional allopathic medicine to homeopathy, osteopathy, eclectic medicine, and even practices focused on herbal remedies and indigenous knowledge. That's the surface-level accepted narrative. It was a mess in need of reform. And then John D. Rockefeller and his foundation stepped in, sponsoring groundbreaking studies and reports that would reshape American medicine into the coherent, science-driven system we recognize today. That's what I accepted, and to a degree, it is true. Then you find the reports, not the famous Flexner report which everyone cites. You find the internal memos, the strategic planning documents from the Rockefeller Foundation itself, housed in the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. You find the budget allocations, the minutes from the board meetings. And in those brittle pages, you find something that changes the question entirely. Not how did they reform medical education, but before 1920, why did they systematically fund the demolition of every single competing medical philosophy and school? The official narrative of medical reform begins, almost universally, with Abraham Flexner and his 1910 report, Medical Education in the United States and Canada. Commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, the Flexner report famously declared that too many medical schools were subpar, lacking scientific rigor, and poorly equipped. It recommended standardizing the curriculum, emphasizing biochemistry, physiology, and pathology, and mandating that medical education be based in university hospitals. The report was groundbreaking. It is credited with closing hundreds of schools, elevating the standards of medical practice, and ushering in the era of modern, science-based Western medicine. This narrative explains how, through focused philanthropic effort and rigorous scientific evaluation, American medicine transitioned from a fragmented, often unscientific collection of practices into a highly respected profession. It acknowledges that many small schools, particularly those built around alternative modalities like homeopathy or eclectic medicine, were indeed closed. But this is framed as a necessary culling, an unfortunate but essential step in the purification of medical science. The prevailing view is that these schools simply could not meet the new, elevated standards for scientific teaching and clinical practice. It was a natural selection, driven by academic rigor. Here is where the official record does something I've come to recognize. It narrows. If you follow the thread further, and I want to be precise about how far I'm following it, you find a deeply specific pattern that strains this narrative of pure, scientific reform. Let's look at the financial records. In 1901, John D. Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. In 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation itself was established, quickly becoming one of the most powerful philanthropic organizations in the world. Their stated goals were noble: to promote public health, advance medical science, and uplift humanity. But their internal documents reveal a far more aggressive, strategic, and frankly, targeted agenda than mere scientific advancement. Between 1910 and 1920, the Rockefeller Foundation poured millions of dollars, a staggering sum for the time, into a very specific vision of medical education. They funded university medical schools that adhered strictly to the allopathic, drug-based model. They funded scientific research using pharmaceutical approaches, and crucially, they engaged in what can only be described as a surgical dismantling of competing philosophies. Take homeopathy. Around 1900, homeopathic medical schools were thriving across America, with significant patient bases and a distinct philosophical approach to healing. The Rockefeller Foundation, through various subcommittees and affiliated organizations, systematically withheld funding from any institution that even entertained homeopathic principles. Moreover, they funded reports, distinct from Flexner's, which specifically targeted the lack of scientific basis for homeopathy, often twisting its core tenets to appear unscientific. He never finishes those sentences, those internal memos detailing engagement strategies with institutions resistant to the allopathic model. They instead pivot to bland statements about promoting the highest standards of evidence-based practice. The goal was not to engage in a debate of efficacy, but to eliminate the competition by starving them of resources and academic legitimacy. Consider the eclectic medical schools. These institutions practiced a blend of botanical medicine, indigenous remedies, and conventional surgery. They were often community-based, focusing on local plant knowledge and accessible care. The Rockefeller Foundations strategy here was even more direct. They funded key faculty departures from eclectic schools to allopathic universities, often with significantly increased salaries and research grants. They offered large endowments to universities on the explicit condition that they absorb and then dismantle eclectic programs. It's not just Flexner's report on standards. It's that you have multiple, independent philanthropic organizations, all heavily influenced or directly funded by Rockefeller interests, making identical demands. They didn't propose to improve eclectic medicine. They proposed to remove it, not subtly, through direct financial leverage and strategic academic recruitment. It is not the individual closure of an eclectic medical school in Cincinnati in 1914 because it couldn't meet new standards. It's not the defunding of a homeopathic college in New York in 1917 for lack of scientific rigor. It's that when you place the Rockefeller Foundation's internal strategic documents next to the financial records, and then next to the specific legislative efforts for medical licensing during the same decade, sourced independently, across states, from both private institutions and governmental bodies, all point to the same outcome: the deliberate consolidation of a single, allopathic model of medicine, and the systematic erasure of all alternatives. I'm not arguing that allopathic medicine is ineffective or that the state of medicine in 1900 was perfect. What the evidence suggests is that the reform was not an organic evolution driven solely by scientific merit, but a meticulously planned, heavily funded, and ruthlessly executed corporate strategy to establish a monopoly. The methods were often disguised as philanthropy and scientific advancement, but the outcome was profoundly anti-competitive. The documents reveal a singular, targeted vision of medicine, one that prioritized pharmaceutical intervention and centralized, top-down control, and eliminated anything that stood in its way. I want to return to the concept of standards. At the time I mentioned it, it seemed an objective, unimpeachable criterion. It isn't. The standards that were applied were inherently biased towards the Rockefeller-funded model of medicine, rendering any alternative inherently substandard by definition. The scientific rigor they championed was defined by a specific paradigm, effectively excluding any medicinal practice that didn't fit that paradigm from the outset. This wasn't about finding the best medicine. It was about creating the only asterisk medicine. The final chapter for Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, an eccentric but widely respected physician and health reformer who advocated for diet, exercise, and hydrotherapy at his famous Battle Creek Sanitarium, embodies this shift. Kellogg was a direct competitor to the emerging pharmaceutical model. He never finished those sentences, his later public statements railing against the drug trust and the Rockefeller medical monopoly. His institution, once a beacon of alternative health, faced increasing pressure, dwindling patient numbers as public perception shifted, and eventually financial ruin. The silence around the systematic nature of this suppression is more specific than the findings. What did we truly gain by eliminating entire branches of medical knowledge? What alternatives, perhaps less profitable but equally or more effective for certain conditions, were lost forever? And whose health was truly served by restricting choice to a single, pharmaceutically driven model? It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed.